What would you do if a billionaire pointed at you in front of everyone and said, "You're fired," only to whisper something moments later that could change your entire life forever? If you love emotional twists, power moves, broken men rebuilding their worlds, and billionaires who test loyalty in ways no one sees coming, hit subscribe now so you never miss the next heart-pounding story. The morning started like any other for Ethan Cole, the single dad who worked harder than anyone else inside Hawthorne Global, the towering multinational empire built by enigmatic billionaire Alexander Hawthorne, a man so feared in the UK and USA business world that even his silence could crush entire careers. Yet Ethan, exhausted, overworked, and carrying the weight of raising his 7-year-old son Liam alone, had no idea that today would not only break him but also become the day everything changed forever. Because as he rushed through the marble lobby clutching Liam's forgotten lunchbox, wearing the same suit he had patched 3 times and replaying the memory of the doctor telling him Liam needed a surgery Ethan could never afford, he didn't notice the billionaire standing on the mezzanine above watching him with cold, unreadable eyes, nor did he see the way Alexander had been studying him for weeks, analyzing the way Ethan treated the janitors, the interns, the delivery men, always with kindness, always with patience, always with words that healed rather than hurt. Something Alexander himself had never known growing up under a father who measured worth in money and fear, and as Ethan reached the elevators breathlessly apologizing to the receptionist for being 1 minute late, the speakers crackled suddenly and a voice cut through the space like thunder, "Ethan Cole, report to the executive conference hall immediately," and everyone froze because no one got summoned there unless something big was happening, usually disastrous, and Ethan's heart dropped knowing he had no room left in his life for disasters, but he went anyway, walking into the long glass room where the billionaire stood alone like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, and before Ethan could speak, Alexander stepped forward, stared directly into his soul, and said the words that shattered the room, "You're fired." The silence that followed felt like a collapse. Ethan's breath left him, his knees trembled, and memories of losing jobs before, of nights feeding Liam half meals so the boy wouldn't notice Ethan wasn't eating, all came flashing back, but he swallowed everything, steadied himself, and whispered, "Sir, may I know why?" His voice shaking not out of fear but out of desperation because losing this job meant losing the only insurance Liam had for the surgery, and for a moment Alexander simply stared at him as if testing his reaction, as if measuring what kind of man Ethan was beyond the resume and neatly written reports, and then the billionaire did something no one expected. He stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could feel his breath, and whispered with an intensity that almost felt like a threat, "You're fired, because I needed to know what a man like you does when the world collapses on him." Ethan blinked, confused and terrified, wondering if this was some cruel psychological game the billionaire liked to play with employees, but before he could respond, Alexander continued, voice quieter, colder, as if revealing a secret he rarely shared, "People say loyalty can be faked. I disagree. Pressure exposes truth." Ethan's fists clenched. He wanted to shout, to demand fairness, to tell Alexander he couldn't just fire a man who had given everything he had, but survival instincts overrode pride as he tried to reason. Explaining rent, medical bills, Liam's health, but Alexander simply observed, almost studying the pain, and said, "You didn't ask who will take care of your responsibilities at the company. You didn't defend your performance. The first thing you mentioned was your son." Interesting. Ethan stood there trembling, feeling like the billionaire was peeling back his life layer by layer with unsettling accuracy, until suddenly Alexander turned his back and murmured, "You see, Ethan, I don't fire people without a reason. And I don't test people without a purpose." The confusion thickened. Ethan didn't know if this was mockery or a sick experiment, but he answered honestly, "My son is my life, sir. Everything else is secondary," and those words struck something deep in Alexander, a place buried under decades of emotional frost, because he too had once been a child begging for his father's attention and receiving only lectures about money and power, and he remembered watching his mother cry alone in penthouses worth millions because her husband valued empire over family, and maybe, without admitting it, Ethan's love for Liam touched a wound Alexander had never healed, but the billionaire didn't show it. Instead he turned sharply and gestured for Ethan to follow him down a hallway leading to a private elevator that no employee had ever entered, and the doors shut behind them with a heavy metallic thud, leaving Ethan alone in a small glass chamber with the coldest, richest man in the city, who stood silently until the elevator rose to the rooftop where wind howled across a garden Ethan never knew existed, a place filled with greenery and impossible stillness, and Alexander walked toward the edge overlooking the entire skyline and said, without turning, "Do you know why I built this?" Ethan didn't. He didn't know why he was there at all, why he had been fired publicly only to be brought privately to the billionaire's secret sanctuary, Why the man who controlled thousands of jobs was now speaking like a philosopher lost in his own thoughts, and Alexander finally continued, because up here, no one lies to me. Not even myself. The statement made no sense to Ethan, but then the billionaire turned, eyes sharper than ever, and dropped the real bombshell: "You're not fired." That was the test. Ethan stared in disbelief, anger and relief crashing together until he could barely breathe, and Alexander added, "I needed to see how you react under pressure. I needed to know if you were the man I've been searching for." Ethan didn't understand any of it. Searching for what? Testing for what? And Alexander walked closer and said something so unexpected Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. "I want to offer you a position that requires absolute integrity, absolute loyalty, and a heart that doesn't break under burden. I needed to see yours break, and still stand." But before Ethan could speak, the rooftop doors burst open and a woman in a charcoal suit sprinted toward them shouting breathlessly, "Mr. Hawthorne, it's happening, your father's company is moving against you." And in that moment everything shifted. The billionaire's expression darkened, the air crackled with tension, and Ethan realized he wasn't just part of some workplace drama. He had been pulled into a billionaire family war brewing beneath the surface, a war that would soon threaten everything he loved, because the billionaire who had just tested him wasn't just powerful, he was hunted. Ethan had never felt more out of place than he did standing on that wind-whipped rooftop beside Alexander Hawthorne, the billionaire who had fake-fired him, evaluated his soul, and now seemed to be caught in the middle of a family war powerful enough to shake the entire corporate world, and as the woman breathlessly announced that Alexander's father was moving against him, Ethan watched the billionaire's jaw clench, a storm gathering behind his controlled expression, and Alexander muttered, almost to himself, "Of course he chose today," before turning back to Ethan with a steadiness that felt almost unreal considering the chaos that had just erupted, and he said, "Cole, you're coming with me, not as a request but as an order," pulling him across the rooftop into a hidden stairwell that spiraled down into a private command room filled with screens, maps, and confidential data feeds Ethan couldn't begin to understand, and suddenly a team of top-tier analysts and security heads were scrambling, throwing updates at Alexander, hostile stock maneuvers, sudden board votes, manipulated media leaks, all coordinated by the man who was supposed to be his own father, Victor Hawthorne, a ruthless titan known in both the US and UK for swallowing up competitors like a shark sensing blood, and as alarms flashed in red across the digital wall, Ethan realized this wasn't just a business disagreement, this was a takeover attempt, a coup orchestrated within the family, and shockingly, Alexander seemed more disappointed than angry, as if he had expected betrayal but hoped against it anyway, and then, to Ethan's utter confusion, the billionaire stepped closer to him again and said, "This is why I needed to test you. I needed someone who doesn't break under chaos. Someone who won't sell me out when pressure is at its highest, because my father is about to try to rip everything from me." Ethan, who had just been trying to hold on to a normal job to save his son's life, felt dizzy as Alexander motioned to a large secure console and said, "Sit." Ethan instinctively shook his head, stammering that he was no strategist, he didn't understand stock battles or corporate warfare, but Alexander cut him off sharply, "I don't need your mind for this part. I need your instincts." And with that, he pulled up a file labeled Project Gauntlet, entering a passcode so complex that the machine processed it for several seconds, and when the file flickered open, Ethan saw his own name at the very top, which sent a rush of confusion through him until Alexander explained, "For months, I've been searching for someone unaffected by greed, someone who doesn't change their moral compass based on fear or reward." Ethan thought this had to be a joke. He was just a single dad trying to stay afloat, not a player in billion-dollar warfare, but Alexander continued, "You passed every test without knowing you were being tested. You defended interns, covered shifts for struggling coworkers, refused to take bribes from the clients who tried to push illegal approvals. Yes, I know about that, and when you were fired, your first thought was your child, not revenge or self-pity." Ethan swallowed hard, realizing that he had been watched far more closely than he ever imagined, and Alexander leaned in, lowering his voice to an almost frightening calm, "My father buys people. He buys their loyalty, their silence, their obedience. But he cannot buy integrity. Which is why he hates me." Then he pointed to Ethan's name on the screen and said, "You are going to help me keep this empire from falling into his hands." Ethan almost laughed, a disbelieving, overwhelmed kind of laugh, because this was insane. He wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a strategist, wasn't anyone except a father drowning under bills, but Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him with unexpected steadiness, and said, "I know what you're thinking. I also know you have something more important than any boardroom skill. Your priorities are in the right place. And people with the right priorities make the right decisions under pressure." Before Ethan could argue further, a security official rushed in, breathless and urgent, blurting out, "Sir, Victor just announced an emergency press briefing, he's accusing you of embezzlement." Ethan's stomach dropped. The billionaire's father wasn't just attacking the company, he was attacking Alexander's reputation, trying to destroy him publicly before the battles inside the boardroom even began, and for a split second Ethan saw something raw flicker in Alexander's eyes, pain, betrayal, maybe even fear, but the billionaire inhaled slowly, masking everything behind his steel facade, and said, "He's faster than I expected. But this only proves he knows he's losing." Then he turned to Ethan again and said something that made no sense at all. "I need you to go pick up your son." Ethan blinked. "What, now, in the middle of all of this?" Alexander nodded, almost impatiently, "Yes. Immediately. He cannot be left unprotected." A wave of ice rolled through Ethan's body as the implication hit him: Liam wasn't safe. Alexander must have read the panic flooding Ethan's expression because he added, "My father fights dirty. If he finds out you're involved with me, he will look for leverage." Children are leverage. Ethan felt his heart stop. The world suddenly narrowed to one thought: Liam. And without a second of hesitation, he sprinted out of the command room, Alexander following behind long enough to shout orders to security teams, assigning 2 armored vehicles to accompany Ethan, and as the convoy sped through the city, sirens slicing through traffic, Ethan's hands shook around his seatbelt, his mind racing, terrified that he was too late, imagining every terrible possibility, especially when they arrived at the school and found the gates unusually quiet, a teacher nervously explaining that a man claiming to be a relative had asked to pick up Liam earlier, but the staff had refused because Liam had no listed relatives, and hearing that made Ethan's legs nearly give out, fear clawing at his throat, but then Liam burst through the classroom door and flew into his arms, sobbing, "Daddy. A man tried to take me." Ethan's world cracked open, relief and terror colliding as he held Liam tighter than ever before, and the security agents moved quickly, sweeping the perimeter, confirming that the man had fled but had clearly been watching the school for some time, and when Ethan returned to Hawthorne Tower with Liam clinging to him, Alexander was waiting near the private elevator, his expression tense, and when he saw the boy unharmed, a visible wave of relief crossed his face. So human, so genuine that Ethan momentarily forgot the man was a billionaire, and Alexander knelt in front of Liam, looking him in the eyes with a solemn seriousness and saying, "No one is ever going to take you away. Not while I'm alive." Liam nodded shakily, gripping Ethan's sleeve, and as the elevator doors closed around the 3 of them, a strange, almost symbolic image formed. The billionaire, the single dad, and the frightened child, ascending together into a battle none of them had chosen but all were now bound to, and as they rose toward the top floors, Alexander's voice lowered into a cold, calculated whisper, "Ethan, my father just declared war. Now we fight back." The final battle for Hawthorne Global ignited the moment Ethan, Liam, and Alexander stepped into the highest floor, where a massive digital board displayed headlines accusing Alexander of crimes he didn't commit, all orchestrated by Victor Hawthorne, who now appeared on every screen smiling like a king reclaiming his throne, but Alexander only exhaled once, then turned to Ethan with an expression both exhausted and resolute, saying, "It ends today, one way or another," and together they entered the war room where Alexander activated a sequence of encrypted recordings he had secretly collected for years, recordings of Victor threatening board members, blackmailing partners, manipulating markets, and even admitting that he framed his own son decades earlier, and with one push of a button Alexander streamed everything live to the media, the government, and every employee in the company, unleashing a storm of truth so powerful that the entire stock market froze for 7 seconds, and as reporters scrambled and board members panicked, Victor crashed into the tower surrounded by security teams that weren't his anymore, roaring that Alexander was a traitor, but Alexander stood calmly between his father and Ethan, shielding the single dad and his son, and for the first time Victor's fury cracked, revealing fear as he shouted, "You're throwing away your legacy for these nobodies." And Alexander responded with a quiet strength sharper than steel, "A legacy built on fear isn't worth having. And they are not nobodies, they are everything you failed to be." With that, federal authorities swarmed in, arresting Victor on live television while cameras captured Ethan holding Liam tightly, the world watching as the empire shifted from tyrant to rightful heir, and when the chaos settled, Alexander turned to Ethan with something almost like softness in his eyes and said, "You helped save my company, now I'm going to save your family," and he personally arranged the top surgeon in the country for Liam, covered every medical bill, offered Ethan a lifetime executive role, and even handed him a keycard to a penthouse floor, insisting, "You deserve safety, not struggle," but Ethan, overwhelmed, could only ask why, and Alexander answered quietly, "Because when I tested you, I wasn't testing your loyalty to me, I was testing whether I could become the kind of man who deserved someone like you on his side. And in that moment Ethan understood that beneath the billions, beneath the power and pain, Alexander was a man who had spent his whole life searching for one thing money couldn't buy: trust. And as Liam wrapped his small arms around Alexander's leg in gratitude, the billionaire froze, then slowly knelt and hugged him back, something he had never done with a child before, and Ethan felt the world shift into something gentler, safer, and strangely family-like. And months later, when Hawthorne Global stood stronger than ever and Alexander visited Liam after a successful surgery, Ethan realized that the moment he had been fired was not the moment he lost everything, it was the moment he unknowingly gained the one ally who would change his entire future. And as the three of them walked out of the hospital together, the billionaire finally smiled and said, "Ethan, you're not just an employee. You're the reason I became a better man." And for the first time since his wife died, Ethan felt like life was finally giving him back more than it took, all because a billionaire once said, "You're fired," and then changed everything.